month's time. So extrapolation can be useful, but it's not really, it's not good enough for many real world problems. So here's how I would see the real way to understand the future is to build a model. Your model will be your lens to let you see further into the future and actually understand how things are going to change and how you can participate in changing them. And so I'm going to show you today what this model could look like based on a number of different inputs from the scientific world, from neuroscience and psychology. And then I'm going to show when you apply that model, what are some of the predictions that it makes. So the theory part, this is kind of your homework. If you're on the master's course, there's lots of citations in here. The slides will come around afterwards, so you don't need to write everything down as you go. But I hope that some of you will maybe recognize some of what I'm going to present from, but also some of it may be new to you as well. There's something fortunate that we can base some of these insights on is that we have, as human beings, we have had to forecast the future before. This is not a new requirement for human beings. And in fact, two of the most basic capacities that humans have had throughout our recent evolution have been very powerful in allowing us to be a successful species. One of those is the ability to coordinate with other people. We're a very social species, and the tools, the cognitive tools that we've developed to do that have helped us to succeed. But also, importantly, the ability to coordinate with our future selves. And this is actually really fundamental. If you are a more basic organism that doesn't have any vision of the future, all you can do is respond to what's happening right now. Respond to the stimuli in your immediate environment. You can't plan, and you are very much at the mercy of the risks of your natural environment. But humans have this ability to think about their future selves, and we have the ability, for example, to defer today's consumption to save something for the future, which can see us over a period when we might not have as many resources. We have the ability to start building things. So, for example, to plant crops or to build cities where you make an investment now and you only get the benefit in the future. But to do that activity successfully, you need to be able to make some kind of prediction. You need to be able to have a brain that can think about the consequences of your actions beyond the present moment. So how does our brain do that? How is it that the human cognitive system has the ability to think about the future and make these important future decisions? I'm going to run through a few theoretical inputs here, and then I'll kind of bring those together into a model at the end. This is a recent, well, really recent over the last 10 to 20 years. This idea of the predictive brain has become an important consensus within cognitive science and neuroscience. So this is the idea that the brain is always making predictions. It's running forecasts at almost every second of the day, and it's making a forecast and then comparing the outcome that it really gets with the forecast that it made to see, was my forecast accurate? Did I get what I wanted? And then updating the model on which it bases that forecast. And so there's lots of neuroscience work that looks at what are the processes in the brain that run these forecasts, and how do we then compare the real outcome with what we expected. So we make these forecasts, but then if we're going to use them for our decisions, we have to evaluate the forecasts. So it's one thing to say, I think that if I take action A, the result will be B, but is B a good outcome or not? And one way that we determine that is that we use affective forecasting. So we simulate the outcome that we are expecting to get, and we then use that simulation to see what are our feelings about that outcome. This is something being called the how do I feel heuristic. And it's essentially a way of connecting your forecasting and predictive capacity of your brain with your experiential capacity of your brain. So you can, instead of experiencing something that's actually happening, you simulate a possible future and experience that as if it was happening to you. And this is something that is quite subtle, but actually a really, really powerful thing, that we can test out our future plans before we have to actually take the risk of experiencing them using this effective outcome. And George Lowenstein, for example, has written nicely on this, this idea that you anticipate the benefits or the pleasures or the pains of your future experiences, and that anticipation contributes to the reward that you get right now. And it's one of the key factors, in fact, in our decisions, is both the reward we expect to get at the time, but also the reward that we get while we're thinking about it in advance. But how do we actually make these forecasts? Well, to make the forecast, you need to have a mental model. And that mental model is a way for you to essentially simulate how the world works and see, if I did this, what would the outcome be? And would it be good or bad? And causal models are one of the key structures by which we do that. So there's the lot of literature about causality. Pearl, who's cited here, is one of the key authors here, but Lanyadoo, who's at UCL, and Steve Sloman are also two of the key thinkers on this. And so they've looked at how we learn the cause and effect relationships in the world, and how we then use those to predict our lives. You see at the bottom there a very simple causal model. Of course, the real causal models are much more complicated because there are lots of influences and contingencies on the events in the world. And in fact, the causal model that we learn about the real world probably contains millions of different elements. And so that causal model then allows you to run a simulation, and you can follow through that maze, the possible actions and their consequences, and the consequences of those, to pick up as you go the simulated reward that you would get from imagining each of those outcomes. And that then tells you is this outcome a good or a bad outcome compared to the alternatives, and then you can make your decision, make your choice. This links to the learning literature, this idea of model-free and model-based learning. Model-free learning is kind of the very simple action and outcome learning. Model-based learning is the idea that between action and outcome, you have a lot of intermediate steps, and that you want to understand those as well, which is more complex, but also gives you a lot more flexibility. And so the literature on this idea of anticipated reward suggests that we actually learn from the rewards that we anticipate, not just from the rewards that we actually get. And this gives our brain a lot of power to transform very complex problems into something tractable that we can actually use to make a decision. So kind of almost chronological summary of the argument is that we learn causal relationships through classical conditioning. We assemble those into more complex causal models. We use mental simulation to understand and predict what might happen when we navigate that model. We use the how do I feel heuristic to evaluate whether that's a good or a bad outcome. There's literature on the kind of low-level neuroscience literature about how that affects the way that dopamine works in the brain, so that our motivations can change based on that anticipation. And then the learning literature looks at this successor representation and model-based reinforcement learning to talk about how do we learn from that whole simulation process so that our future decisions can become even better, and how does that learning in turn affect the models in a kind of continuous iterative loop. And all this goes together in this idea of cognitive economics, which is the economic theory that explores how do we use the intangible objects inside our head as economic tools and as economic goals, so that, for example, we're not just pursuing our material interests. We're not just looking for, say, money or to have the the best car or the best food that we can get, but we're also really interested in optimizing the internal cognitive state that we experience, because that is what gives us a positive experience of the world. So cognitive economics says, how do we trade off material against intangible goods, and where do we get those intangible goods? How do we produce them in the first place? So this kind of links all the way from the neuroscience at the low level right up to economics and social outcomes at the top. So that's kind of the different threads of theory that we pull together in our work at Irrational Agency. We have a label that we put on this that might make it kind of unify it into an easy to remember concept, because this is ultimately about decision making. It's about making good decisions and understanding the processes that people use to make those decisions in real life. You will all know the decision-making model of System 1, the automatic unconscious mind, and System 2, the more calculating deliberative mind. But I think that the processes we're talking about here, the mental simulation, the generation of synthetic reward as an outcome of that mental simulation, actually falls outside of those two, and I call that System 3. So it's the idea that we have a distinct group of processes that are not totally automatic, but they're also not completely calculating and deliberative. They still rely on emotion and reward. You'll have seen this variations of this table, I'm sure, where you have these two classes of process, and I think if we think about some of these, the processes through which we really imagine our future experiences and make decisions based on those, they really don't fit into that simple model. Because if you imagine, the dinner you're going to have tonight after this seminar, it's not automatic, it's not unconscious, because you're aware of the experience, but it's not very logical. It's quite imaginative, creative. And so I would say there is a third class of process called System 3 that in a way it completes the picture. It helps to fill in a gap, I think, in our current understanding of decision making. And in a way, even though it's called System 3, it actually might sit more intermediate between System 1 and 2, because it's probably something that comes after, in evolutionary terms, the simple stimulus response learning of System 1, but before the more linguistic and logical emergence of System 2. That's a bit speculative, but I think this is it's at least an interesting way to think about decision making. And it's produced some good results in terms of our practical work, because it helps us to answer some of these real business questions about the future. So how do we turn that theory into a set of practical tools that we can use in a real business to help that company understand its customers' behavior or the future of the economic environment that it lives within? We started looking at the COVID questions, and so we asked people some questions like this. So what we're doing here is we are taking people. This was an online test. We recruited several hundred people to go through a set of questions like this. We help people to create a narrative. And that narrative started in the past. So it started with things like, well, when you heard that Bojo had got COVID, did you kind of burst out laughing, or did you feel very sympathetic, or something else? We're taking people through their past experiences, which have led to the encoding of that causal model. And then we start taking them into their future experiences. So we start to say, how do you think you're going to feel tomorrow or in the coming days? What do you predict that the next shortage might be in the shops? And then we drill further into those, because every cause an effect model can have multiple effects. We can have this complex chain of a causal model. And so we drill further past the immediate short-term kind of instant cause and effect into the subsequent effects of that. And we also record the open-ended answers that people give, because the language that they use can be indicative of how they're thinking. And they also might think of ideas and concepts that we did not include in our hypothesis. So this provided a lot of really interesting information about how people see, consciously and unconsciously, how they predict the future. This is what it can look like. These are actually from a couple of earlier studies, one on a new food product that was being trialed and the other on driving safety. And this is what we started to see. So this is the part of the causal model that we generated for the COVID questions. So what are the first things that people are planning to do or expecting to do once the lockdown is lifted? We did this research back in May, so it was while everything was still closed down and we hadn't yet had the partial reopening. So people were very interested in seeing their family. They wanted to go to restaurants, get their hair cut. But we were able to measure not just what did people expect, but also how positive or negative did that feel. So the darker blue are the more positive feelings, the lighter blue are the more negative ones. So you found that people were not very keen to go to parties, for example. A lot of people expected to go to work, but they weren't too happy about it. But visiting family is a very strong positive feeling. So overall, this reward score is a way of kind of summarizing the expected reward, the anticipated reward, on a scale from -100 to +100. And so people were feeling reasonably positive about getting out of lockdown. When we asked them to look further forward to the kind of how they would be living their life after lockdown was over, we had these more abstract concepts came out. So rather than individual events, we're looking at people's feelings and their associations. So at the top right, you have this set of more negative emotions. People are worried, they're scared, and I think we've seen that play out in the world that we have now seen a few months later, as the situation has started to get to evolve further. At the bottom left, you have these more positive feelings and more positive responses. So people were very much looking forward to a world that was, happier and better than the one they were in at that time. And there's some interesting kind of links and connections in there, that concepts that are seen as causally relevant to each other. And so, for example, if we zoom into some of the individual details of this graph, we can see that when people think about something being beautiful, which was one of the words that they came up with, they link that to the idea of being open-minded and also to happiness. So this idea of beauty has quite a high reward score, which makes people anticipate a lot of pleasure, and so that in turn helps to encode that as a key concept in their model of the future world. This is one that we measured the previous year, and so this is a slightly this one is more focused on a specific category, so it's clothing. This is for Primark, the clothing retailer, and the reason I show this is because this one was a really important test for us, because it was a validation of the fact that this measure that we are recording, this idea of reward score, is actually predictive of behavior and is genuinely connected to behavior. So we took the map that people had, and you can see lots of different associations that people would have with different brands in the clothing industry. And we discovered that the reward score that people got when they think about Primark was very, very strongly predictive of their frequency of shopping at Primark. So if when they think about Primark, they have very positive associations about fun or trendiness or good value, then this is predictive of them shopping frequently at Primark. You can definitely debate the causality here. There's, this is not an RCT, so you could have a hypothesis that people go to Primark and then they get happy, and therefore it creates associations. So we're thinking of whether we can do an RCT now with the client to actually measure the causal effect, so that they can aim to boost those positive associations, that positive mental simulation, and therefore increase the number of people who shop at their store. Finally, this one is from our restaurant client. So we can see that this is the map for their employees of what motivates them and what the experience that they predict they're going to get when they work at this restaurant. And so you can see that there are a range of different positive outcomes that they expect, and we can drill into the specific sections of this graph and see that there's a cluster of things to do with career development. That turned out to be particularly motivating for older people over 25, whereas things like for people at more kind of in the 18 to 22 range, they were very much motivated by the social aspect of the job. And everyone wants, of course, more money and so forth, but actually sometimes these intangible aspects are more motivating for people than just an extra £1 per hour on the wage. And so I'll quickly just come back to those three questions that we asked at the beginning, these three example questions from the COVID world. How can we boost the prices or the demand for snacks and crisps? When will people start eating out again? And how will the furlough scheme affect unemployment outcomes? So some of the answers that came up in the snack world were perceived scarcity. So it turned out that the people were getting this familiarity with running out of product. The shelves were empty a few months ago. Some of the common products were disappearing from the stores, and we found that this is a good association for driving demand. So, for example, limiting the number of bags that somebody can buy, that each customer can buy, makes people want the product more. So this is an interesting thing that companies can use to drive demand. In terms of communication, this idea of beauty came up, and the idea that something beautiful can be especially rewarding. So if you can make people think of beauty, then they're going to have positive mental associations with your product. And then choosing the right comparison points. One of the key things about this, how does it feel heuristic, is it operates on multiple outcomes. So if you're making a choice, you might be choosing between A and B and C. You will mentally simulate all of those three, and the one that has the most positive, rewarding simulation is likely to win. So by choosing the right comparison point, you make your product more likely to win that contest. The second question was, when would people start eating out again? And so this was kind of our forecast. We'd have a small number of people coming back on immediately that the pubs would open. Pardon me. You'd have a bigger group that would return over the following 2 weeks, and then a substantial cohort of 30 to 40% of people who wouldn't go back for 6 months. And I think we are seeing this now playing out. There are still a lot of people who will not go back to the pubs and restaurants, even though they have, in fact, reopened. And finally, what's the kind of broader long-term economic impact? Well, we built the tool into an agent-based model, which we used to link together some of the epidemiological forecasts with some of the economic consequences that would come from those. So we had both, we could start to look at the behavioural interplay between, if people have less money, is that more likely to make them want to go out and go to work, even though they might be encouraged not to, and that in turn spread the virus further. So we can, in an agent-based model like that, you can start to look at those more complex second-order effects that don't directly come out of a simple prediction. And so, according to this forecast, we're in our temporary recovery, October 20, and we might be unfortunately getting a bit of a further economic dip in the coming months. But this forecast was a few months ago, so it may be that we need to update it again with the latest insights from how people are now seeing the world, because our future looks different to how it did even a few months ago. And now we have some time for questions. So I think I may have gone over 5 minutes, but hopefully we still have 25 minutes to cover Q&A. I see that there are some questions coming in.
Yeah.
So I'll let Gaia handle the questions or direct the questions to me. I look forward to talking to you, and feel free to drop me a line or follow me on Twitter if you want to talk outside of this context too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leigh. That was so interesting. I really found nice how you blended first a theoretical context and then showed us how you actually use it. Because we, in our masters, we usually tend to see just the theory, and it's nice to see how it connects to practice. So there are already a few questions in Q&A. And the first one is about the how do I feel heuristic.
Mm-hmm.
And it says people are not very good at estimating how they will feel in the future. And I think it might refer, for example, to the optimism bias. Mm. So how do you and other cognitive economists take this into account?
Yeah, well, that's absolutely right. And this is why we don't just ask people a question like, tell me how you will feel in 6 months. We take them through this step-by-step process. So we help them to see what are the likely steps between now and then. So this guided, almost narrative process. But also what we're doing when we measure this causal map, we're measuring the relationship between stimulus and response. So, for example, I might not know, I might not be able to tell you this person will feel happy in 6 months, but I probably could tell you if they get a pay rise, then they will be happy immediately afterwards. Or if they catch coronavirus, then they'll be unhappy. You can see the more direct causal effects, and then you can assemble those into this map so that you can make somewhat more longer range forecasts. So the idea is really to say, in a way, it's about getting people to make those conditional forecasts, and then by assembling those and by potentially looking at broader economic data, you can then make an unconditional forecast based on an aggregate of multiple people.
But you still need to take into account what people think of the future, right? Because they will base their decisions on that too. So how do you blend the two things?
I mean, in a way, this map does some of that blending, because you can ask people some longer term and some shorter term questions together and see if you can link those together within the map. In the case of the agent-based model, we make the assumption that people are in a way they're superimposing multiple causal pathways on top of each other. So you might have let's say you have a pathway that's to do with your career. So you have maybe you have more visibility that you will of what your job's going to look like in 6 months or 12 months, because that might be the career path that you're on. And then you might have some very short-term things to do with your consumption of products and goods that is to do with, what is in the house or what you go to the supermarket and what's available on the shelves. And then maybe some really long-term things like I'm saving for my pension in 40 years. So the agent-based model can superimpose those different scales of prediction and see if how do they add together to create an overall anticipated experience. So in a way, it depends on what the question is you're trying to answer. So if the question is, will people buy these snacks, then it's probably less important, what their future career goals are. Whereas if the question is, will they stay in my company after they've been here for 2 months, then it's the reverse. You can probably ignore the short-term stimulus about what they're eating today, but you want to understand and model their state of mind in over a slightly longer period.
Thank you. Just a quick question. Someone's asking, how do you call those map and representations that you showed? Are they just causal maps, or?
We call it an implication map. So the map is, I mean, in general, there's a whole class of mathematics called graph theory that deals with these graphs, and so it's a directed graph. You may, if you look at the causal literature, you'll see something called a DAC, directed acyclic graph. These are not acyclic because they actually can be cyclic, they can loop round, but it's related to that same kind of class of objects. We call it an implication map because, in fact, we think that what people are learning is slightly more general than pure causality. In fact, people look for causality, and that's kind of what the brain intuitively wants, but we aren't always good at recognizing it. Often you don't have enough data to truly determine causality, but you can determine predictiveness. You can see that, if I, when I open a bar of chocolate wrapper, then there will be chocolate inside. That's not really a causal relationship. The wrapper didn't cause the chocolate, but it does predict the chocolate. So in fact, when you think about a more general class of relations called implication, then your map becomes actually more reflective of how people really learn.
Yeah, thank you. So someone's asking, you said system 3, the imaginative one, is more like the in-between of system 1 and system 2. Could you explain that a bit more? Sure.
So the way that I see this, and this is kind of my interpretation, I don't have a firm evidence for this, but I see that system 1 is really about learning. It's the model-free way of learning. It's about understanding a very instantaneous one-step relationship between stimulus and response, A and B. So the classic thing, I touch the hot stove and I jump back. That's my stimulus and response. That's like one edge of this graph. So the A, B, and the line between them, that's kind of a system 1 learning. When you assemble those into something bigger, and you start to see, well, if I do this, then that will cause this, that will cause this, that will cause this, then that's, in a way, that's the next level up. But this is something that we have reason to believe that non-human animals can do some of this as well. So we can look at what's called offline replay in rats, maybe who have learned to navigate a maze. And you can look at their neurons and you can see that they're replaying some of the process. They're doing a mental simulation of navigating the maze. And with larger animals, I think you can see this more. People, certainly my friends who own dogs and cats, tell me that they can see them dreaming and they know that they're, imagining something. So I say that that's intermediate because I think you then have a level of logical, linguistic, almost algebraic decision making that represents system 2, and that I think is more complicated, more abstract, and requires you to disconnect your reward system in a way. So system 3 still relies on the same reward system as system 1. It's still the idea that we're testing out our actions to see if they're rewarding, and so that's still a relatively low level capability. System 2 allows you to kind of step away from the reward and to just think about symbolic manipulation. So I see that as being a level of both complexity and probably evolutionary sophistication that goes beyond system 3. That's why I say that it's in between.
Okay, so if it's you said it's imaginative and so it's also some of it is conscious, some of it it's not really conscious, not really logical.
Mm-hmm.
So is there a way to predict what people will mentally simulate on? So what will be the content of their mental simulations? Are there any predictors of things that will more frequently come to mind?
I mean, I think the idea of building these maps is to make exactly that prediction. So my hypothesis is that we are mentally simulating the contents of that map. And so when you measure the which elements of the map are more strongly connected to each other, or which ones are more rewarding, those are the ones that the brain will in a way be motivated to simulate more frequently. Motivation is obviously a bit of a metaphor there, but so I would say that you could predict that the more rewarding and the stronger links are more likely to be simulated. I think these simulations are also triggered by environmental factors. So one of the concepts I like is the idea of affordance. So affordance is often talked about in terms of design. It might be like a door handle has affordance if you can very easily imagine and see yourself how to reach out and turn the handle. That to me is likely to be a mental simulation process. Is if you walk past the door handle, your eye sees it, and your brain immediately rehearses the process of reaching out to pull the handle. That's a mental simulation, and so it's in a way I think the brain is always on the lookout. This is back to that predictive brain idea. The brain is on the lookout for actions it could take, and is continually simulating the possible actions to see which ones kind of ring the bell of reward and say, okay, actually, if you do reach out that door handle and open it, then something nice is on the other side. It's so I think the simulations are partly triggered by environmental context and partly by what's more rewarding and what are the best learned links. There is one other theory actually that we simulate where there is uncertainty. So if you have a highly uncertain situation, then you're more likely to keep running the simulation to see which outcome is more likely or which one you want to choose. And this is potentially thought to explain things like if you're, let's say you've had a test for cancer and you don't have the result yet, then you're really probably thinking a lot about it. You're really obsessing, oh, is it going to be positive or negative? What's going to happen? Is it good or bad? And some people say that when they get the result, even if the result is, yes, you do have it, it's actually better. Like they'd rather know and they'd rather stop thinking about it because they know the answer than to have the uncertainty even when there's a possible positive outcome. So I think uncertainty can often drive that simulation as well.
Okay, thank you. That's a great answer. I'm going to have Rosemary come on stage and ask her question directly.
Sure.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, we can.
Great. Hi, thank you, Leigh. So first of all, very interesting. So thank you for all of this. I'm curious a little bit about you personally and how you kind of gotten where you are now. And just from looking at your LinkedIn, I see that you went from mathematics to kind of pure software, maybe technology, and now where you are, which is this more behavior science, economics research. And I'm curious, just now as a student myself, were you always interested in the behavior science and the economic side of it, or did that change at some point and you became very interested in this, or was it kind of always influenced by that?
Sure. Thank you for being interested in that. It's nice to be asked a question like that too. I was always interested in cognitive science, and when I was at university, I used to build little bits of software and try to kind of make like many artificial intelligence kind of machines and so on. It was very early in the development of that kind of technology, so it didn't really go anywhere. But it was always something that an interest that I had. I remember reading the book Gödel, Escher, Bach, which some of you will probably know, and that was one of the kind of my inspirations in getting interested in this field, understanding, how the brain works. And I had a mathematics background, so it was natural for me to think, how do I use mathematics to model cognition and to understand it? But in a way, I got, really, I came out of university in the mid-90s, and the internet was such a big opportunity. It was just starting out as a really commercial space. And so initially I got into that by working on a kind of online newspaper that was me and some friends were starting up to try and, just be crusading journalists and discover the truth about the world and uncover corruption. And that turned out to be very impractical, but we learned enough about, how to build websites to start to just try to take take advantage of a big opportunity. And there, obviously there was lots of money to be made back then in the internet, and I tried to make some of it and did, had limited success. But that sent me down a path for 5 or 10 years in software building until I kind of got to a point where I realized, I can't build good software unless I understand psychology, because who's using the software? People. Human beings are using this software, and they, I'm making assumptions about how they behave. I'm making assumptions about their motivation and their rationality. And actually, when I think about, let's say you're an employee of a company, and I've built a piece of software for you to do your work. I really should understand your motivation and how you process information, and whether your interested incentives are aligned with the company's interested incentives, if I'm going to, make good software that will help you do your job well. And so I set off to kind of learn, revisit the psychology world that I'd had an interest in, but I hadn't really studied. And I started coming, in fact, one of the first things I did was I went to UCL, and I went to the LJDM seminars, the decision-making seminars that I think are still going on every week, and just kind of threw myself into watching people's psychology presentations and decision-making presentations, learned kind of from the ground up that way, and then started to gradually see, okay, how can I bring all these different influences together, start to understand the theory, and then start to see how can I take that back out to the business world and apply it. So I think probably in about 2009 or 10, I was among the first people to start using behavioral science in the commercial world. And it's it's been a fascinating kind of journey since then to see how it's become more and more adopted and more mainstream among companies in the UK and everywhere else.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing.
You're welcome.
There's actually a somewhat related question in the Q&A, and it's about how you blend research and practice in your day-to-day life. So how do you spend most of your working hours or day?
Yeah, that very much depends on how projects are going. My goal is to spend about 50-50, about 50% on theory, on paper writing, on academic and scientific work, and 50% on commercial. It really depends. Beginning of this year was a period that I had the chance to do more theoretical work. This summer, perhaps because of the uncertainty of COVID, our business has really been extremely busy and high demand. And so the last few months, I've had a lot more focus on delivering projects for clients and less on theory. But I try to manage 50-50, and I have a good team who are good at delivering most of the commercial side of the work. So I try to rely on them for that, and they just pull me in when they need to, and otherwise try and let me get on with writing another speculative paper about some neuroscience concept.
There was a question who does that research that you showed us was for, so it depends. It's client by client. Is that?
Yes. So Primark was one of the ones I could share because it happens to be, I've presented that work in public with them at a conference, so they're okay with that being shared. The the Snacks research was for a different company. The COVID research, we actually did, we decided to do our own COVID research rather than, that wasn't commissioned by a client, so that we did that on our own initiative because we thought it would be, it would provide enough general insights that would be interest to a number of clients that we could then take in and develop further with individual clients.
So from a different perspective, as a consumer, how can we take into account system three to make smarter decisions?
That's probably a whole other seminar about that. I think that, I mean, one thing I try to do is really enjoy system 3. So really, you get a lot of value out of your own imagination and out of the, you know, the pleasures and the experiences that you anticipate. So, you know, classic one is a holiday. Many of us may not have been able to travel much in the recent months, but if you think about, you know, the holiday you're going to take next year and where you're going to go, and you can get a lot of pleasure just from anticipating and playing it out in your head and thinking of what you'll do and who you'll meet and all the food you will eat. You know, that's not a very commercial answer maybe because it doesn't generate any revenue for anyone, but I think like the goal of economics is not to generate money. The goal of economics is to make people happy and give them a good life. So if you can, you know, as a consumer, just appreciate the value that you can get from mental simulation. In more practical terms, one of the classic effects is in terms of mental simulation is affect misattribution. So you're in the store and you're going to buy some food, and you imagine how hungry you're going to be when you eat the food, but actually you're really influenced by how hungry you are now. And if you're really hungry, you're going to buy too much stuff and it's probably going to be unhealthy. But if you go to the store when you're less hungry, then it affects you less, or if you're aware of it. So there's been some experimental work on when you make the present emotions salient for people, then it acts like a bit of an immunization. So if you go to the store and you recognize that you're hungry and you're aware of it, you're more likely to make a better decision because you can disconnect the current feeling from the anticipated future feeling. So that's you know, that might be a little bit obvious, but that's kind of a tip. And I suppose the tip that I give to companies, in fact, is use communication. So the design of your pack or your advertising, use that to help people feel and understand the experience they're going to get from your product. So help them to do the mental simulation, because then they'll engage more with your product and they're more likely to buy it. So in a way, I don't think that's a trick. I think that's a kind of a win-win. So the consumer gets some benefit from that as well, as does the company. So hopefully some of the work that I do for companies is not just you know, manipulating people into buying more stuff, but actually gives them something benefit as well.
We're running out of time, but I'm gonna direct the last question to you. Mm-hmm. And are businesses becoming more aware of the benefits of behavioral science insights? And I guess the answer is yes. So two related questions could be like, how about cognitive insights? Because that's nowhere. Maybe.
Yeah. So yes, behavioral science is starting to become more and more significant to businesses. But I do feel they have a quite limited view of it. So, you know, you will get loads of people who know about System 1. And in fact, there's a whole company in our industry called System 1 Group they've renamed themselves after System 1 because that's the most, it's a simple concept that people who are not educated in this area can still understand very easily. And you can recognize System 1 kind of impulses in yourself very well. So there is, and the other idea is nudging. You know, people like the idea that they can apply nudges to their customers to get them to buy more stuff. So there is this understanding, but it's relatively kind of crude and simple. The cognitive insights are only starting to creep in. You know, you obviously have people in, say, the advertising world who are good at getting people to stimulate their imagination and good at, in a way, shaping the mental state of a customer or indeed an employee. But I think that's one of these things where it's done intuitively. It's not done scientifically. It's done based on the craft of a good advertising person. But I think if you look at the talks by somebody like Rory Sutherland, who you may have seen his TED talk, he's kind of one of the early people again to have brought this behavioral science into the world of business. Actually, a lot of the stuff he's talking about is cognitive. It's about intangible experiences more than it is about nudging people. So I think his work is a good example of that.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm afraid we'll have to wrap it up. So thank you so much, Leigh, for being here today. And thank you, audience, for asking interesting questions. We hope to see you next week for our event in collaboration with the FinTech Society at UCL. But in the meantime, you can follow us on all our social media and join us for a Zoom discussion. You'll find a link in the chat if you're following from Zoom. And I believe it's also in the email you received as a reminder. And hope to see you there.
Thanks. I'm going to stick around for at least a little while for the networking. Does that take place here in the same Zoom webinar?
No, you will find the link in the chat. If you're
that's for the discussion. Okay, I see. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, thanks. See you all soon.
Bye.